The Lord of the Rings occupies a unique, privileged, and beloved place in the English-speaking world. Its characters and themes, its setting, and, when reduced to one, its broader aesthetic, have cemented themselves in popular consciousness in ways few other novels have managed over the past couple of centuries. Depicting a slumbering world dragged into the waking hell of war and uncertainty, the story's characters are at once larger than life in speech and deed, yet altogether realistic enough to practically walk right off the page. Tolkien had much to say about The Lord of the Rings, writing extensively about the creative process that brought it about in private correspondence. These, along with drafts and notes, have been made available thanks to the work of Christopher Tolkien, who spent the rest of his life curating and safeguarding his father's legacy to the best that he could. This came often at the expense of proposals to take the story public, to license it, turn it over to a collection of corporate execs whose only relation to the work is its status as a saleable product. Unfortunately, licensing did take place at a time when the estate was in great financial need, and as a result, film adaptations of The Lord of the Rings began in the late 70s. By some stroke of cool-headed zeitgeist, these films, although popular enough to receive cult followings after the fact, did not ignite broad cultural interest in the title. The books were made popular, of course, but aside from closely knit communities of avid fantasy readers, the story had not yet become the household name that it is today. Peter Jackson's films in 2001, however, would change that. This piece is a reaction to that phenomenon. Jackson's films will be given treatment, as will the text of The Lord of the Rings itself, but only in order to service the main thrust, that the popular consensus of Tolkien's work has been skewed as a result of The Lord of the Rings becoming a licensed property, and this deformation has been exacerbated by the explosion of consumer media. Tolkien's works do not fit easily into the interpretive mode required by consumer media. However, due to the proliferation of the films, popular consciousness has replaced his novel with the media that has surrounded it. At heart, however, this piece is about the differences between artistic creative endeavors and the flattened, simplified products of mass-produced consumer media. Some may accuse this of being a distinction without due cause, or a sophistic and unnecessary overcomplication of things that are in fact only distinguished according to some level of quality. This is not the case, however, as will be argued toward the end. This first section establishes some definition of fantasy, fairy story, and ultimately of art, while introducing a distinct definition for consumer media. Tolkien is relied upon to define the foremost of these terms, as consumer media, at least as it has come to exist in its current form, was not as prolific and inescapable as it was when he first published The Lord of the Rings. Section 2 focuses on the distinction between The Lord of the Rings as it is written down and The Lord of the Rings as it is popularly conceived. This section uses excerpts from the text in Tolkien's letters and positions them against the film series that catapulted the works out of the hands of fantasy literature enthusiasts and into the mass-market popular culture. The express purpose of this contrast is not specifically to denigrate Peter Jackson's film franchise, nor is it an in-depth critical analysis of either the books or the films. Rather, it is to illustrate how differently Tolkien considered his novel, what it was about, and why he wrote it compared to how modern audiences engage, or fail to engage with it. For this reason, the study is limited to only 3 aspects of the work: how Tolkien uses setting, violence, and politics in Lord of the Rings. Of special import here will be how he expresses real things and draws upon real experiences in order to create his fantasy, and how this aspect of his work is totally neglected in the popular forms of fantasy media. In the last section, the distinctions, if any, between art and consumer media are studied and elaborated upon. With the examples of the second section on display, and with the assistance of Tolkien's own definitions of the key terms, we make apparent any substantial differences between works of art and works of consumer media. Similarly, this section will address the reasons that one creates a work of art versus consumer media, as well as the reasons an audience seeks out a work of art versus that of consumer media. This will form the conclusion, drawing off of Tolkien while offering some final critique of his definitions, seeking a synthesis between his views on art and my own. In 1939, Tolkien wrote On Fairy Stories as a lecture to be given at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, which was later published as an essay in 1947. It would be fair to assume that his beliefs about fairy stories, fantasy, narrative, and literature in general in this essay most closely matched those he believed as he was writing The Lord of the Rings, given that he had begun writing the latter only 2 years before the lecture had completed and 2 years before the essay's publication. At a little over 40 pages, it's not a short read. In it, Tolkien covers the essence of fairy tales, how children view them, as well as some formalized thoughts on escapism more broadly. Of specific interest is his definitions of art and fantasy, how these relate to the world, the storyteller, and the reader, and the purpose of both writing and reading fantastic stories. Throughout the essay, Tolkien expresses subcreation, or the act of creation from the imagination, as the basis of artistry. Narrative serves as the literary mode of creating a secondary world, an alternate reality that requires greater development than simple decoration. Efforts, or idols, that fail to embark upon such development he refers to as frivolous and merely fanciful. He explains, quote, anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say the green sun, but that is not enough. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding a secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story-making in its primary and most potent mode. It almost seems as though he's referring to something quite different from literature. Literature, after all, is concerned with character, plot, setting, and style, each playing significant roles and forming some narrative or other. Tolkien, however, starts with setting and holds it above the other three as the preeminent pillar upon which any narrative can function. And this is deliberate, as he holds drama to be distinct from the literary narrative as an art. The entertainment of a hypothetical, what if the sun was green, followed by the elaborate processes of defining how different things would be in such a situation. This calls to mind the special effects artist, a dioramist, a platform model enthusiast similar to the now near-extinct train hobbyists. Subcreation, then, is an act of model building, and it refers also to the model that is built. In the case of Tolkien, the model's medium is that of literature, as opposed to, say, balsa wood, plaster, electric engines, and 1:87 scale locomotives. This is important to note. A model is a representation of reality. Tolkien, although he does not mention this, and although he goes in a different direction with his observations, operates under these pretenses. In fact, in order for his secondary world to exist, it must exist within the primary world, the real, observed, tangible reality, as a subservient, if partly distinct, subcreation. His alternate reality seeks to explain the primary one. The term model is used only slightly differently in different contexts. Attractive women are hired to be models in order to exemplify a standard of beauty, often toward the ends of presenting clothing or accoutrements in idealized settings. This definition leans heavily into the aesthetics of human experience. Mathematics and the sciences use models to study certain phenomena, be those phenomena the behavior of numbers or circumstances of physical environments. In either case, the model is a defined space subservient to but mostly distinct from reality. It is an intellectual laboratory in which to conduct experiments. The observations are informed by real life, but the data generated by the model is ideally restricted to the closed system that defines the model. Both cases seek to study or otherwise exemplify a particular ideal. Both draw upon the natural order to make presumptions about the ideal, something that transcends the fallenness of the natural world so as to have a tangible object by which to study it. By studying the model, one can glimpse the transcendental, and he thereby comes to better ascertain the realities of nature. One flows to the other and then back again, transformed. In much the same way does Tolkien use the terms subcreation and secondary world. The latter specifically creates a model, a fictional environment, albeit with the beauty of created things as its object. A fictional world brings with it real life in order to be better understood as a fictional world, and, as Tolkien even argues, in order for that fictional world to be relevant to the audience. Quote, probably every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the particular quality of this secondary world, if not all the details, are derived from reality or are flowing into it. If he indeed achieves a quality that can fairly be described by the dictionary definition, inner consistency of reality, it is difficult to conceive how this can be if the work does not in some way partake of reality. The particular quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction, and an answer to the question, is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world, well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist part of the artist. But in the eucatastrophe, we see a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium into the world." End quote. Tolkien expresses here that well-crafted narratives, although being fiction, are composed of reality and thus, in turn, shed the light of the meaning found within them back on reality. He frames it in his terms of subcreation and fantasy, but fiction being fiction, what applies to a well-constructed secondary world or model also applies to the narrative that shapes it as much as it takes place within it. As stated before, a story remains a story, no matter what setting it takes place in or what characters comprise its drama. In the case of fiction, if you have no narrative, you have nothing else. A narrative is both what allows the secondary world to come into existence, as well as the means by which any audience is able to access it, or, using a better term, interpret it. True, one may spend inordinate amounts of time, as Tolkien himself did, drawing maps and composing grammars and imagining names, but without narrative, these secondary worlds are not only inaccessible to any audience, but also irrelevant to reality past the idle speculation of their dreamer. This is not the composition of art, but rather the indulgence of a very thorough daydream. This will be treated with more seriousness in the following segment, but for our purposes here, Tolkien stressed the importance of not daydreaming but active and lucid forethought in the creation of art. Subcreation demands the full attention of its subcreator, as his subcreation must by its existence generate or reflect some order or meaning. As Tolkien wrote, art is the human process that produces, by the way, it is not its only or ultimate object, secondary belief. This work must be so thorough and its narrative so compelling as to completely maintain a suspension of disbelief. There is a famous anecdote from Sir Alec Guinness when, late in his life, he encountered a 12-year-old who had enthusiastically professed to have seen Star Wars some 100 times. Looking in the boy's eyes, I thought I detected little star shells of madness beginning to form, and I guessed that one day they would explode, he wrote, whereupon he insisted to the boy never to watch the films again. According to Guinness, the boy burst into tears and his mother reprimanded the actor, but Guinness nonetheless hoped the boy, now in his 30s, is not living in a fantasy world of second-hand childish banalities. Guinness famously soured on Star Wars, having initially found the story ridiculous on its face, but his disdain compounded greatly when the film reached monumental, and for the cast, quite unexpected heights of popularity. As one can imagine, Guinness preferred his career defined by more serious works of cinema than that of a space wizard from a Flash Gordon homage. But, despite the harsh words from his autobiography, he was also somewhat of an unreliable narrator to his own life. Although the exchange did indeed occur, he didn't seem to go out of his way to make a child burst into tears. All this aside, he characterized the sort of fanatical obsession as a form of madness in a manner that should sound all too relatable to the average internet denizen. The last 20 years saw an explosion of geek media, aided in part by the proliferation of accessibility to the internet, as well as the normalization of nerd material by Hollywood and other mainstream outlets. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, video and table games, streaming services, social media, and even politics has turned entertainment into a vehicle of pure escapism. One can spend an entire day, even a life, wrapped up in the consumption of narratives without ever facing the realities of his true personal circumstances, except maybe to use the bathroom or eat a meal or perhaps freeze when the house is repossessed. The rise of fandoms and their most extreme adherents illustrate this sad reality all too well. When confronted with this sort of madness, one desires an easy definition, to place reality up and against fantasy, wherein one must choose a particular world to live. Reality, being exterior to ourselves, is more real and agreed upon. It is social, it is tangible, and therefore it seems as the obviously correct choice. All those who flee from the responsibilities and hardships of reality therefore must be fantasists, deserters, or, at their most extreme, schizophrenics. These are men who have abandoned life in order to reside in a cell so small that not even walls exist for it, as its borders are the region of their minds. For these men, fantasy suffices, even as their body withers into frailty and their soul rots in its own vessel. And if one has given up on reality, what counter-argument can be offered? What plea can be made that can bring them out of their shells? None, of course, and this completely defines their insanity. However, fiction and storytelling, and fantasy too, are not so simple. Reasoned out to its extreme, the belief above leads to the tiresome regurgitations of a dissatisfied striver's lifestyle, where all recreation is shunned unless it somehow furthers personal or professional goals. A disdain for fantasy in toto naturally implies a disdain for the impulse to fantasize, and while fantasizing is often a poor use of time, The impulse that draws a man toward fantasies is the same impulse that draws a man toward leisure, and more importantly, subcreative acts, art. The war on leisure is well documented and remains one of the most unjust wars fought in the secular age. In response, one can remember St. Charles Borromeo when he was famously quoted, when asked what he would do if he knew he had only 15 minutes left to live during a game of pool. "I would keep playing billiards." Tolkien, it would seem, greatly values the escapist elements of fairy stories and fantasy more broadly, particularly in narrative form. Through storytelling, a man is able to escape the drudgery inflicted by the modern industrialized world, a sentiment that Tolkien goes to great lengths emphasizing throughout his essay on fairy stories. Perhaps his most famous quote on the topic comes from this very essay, though it is frequently misquoted. Quote, "Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word. And what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter." Tolkien refrains from elaborating further on the distinctions between the escaped prisoner and the fleeing deserter, but the use of terminology serves ample enough purpose. Throughout the piece, Tolkien expresses skepticism at the sort of dichotomy between real and fantastical, insofar as they are separate realms wherein one must be abandoned in order for the other to serve as a home. Rather, fantasy should function in a mythopoeic mode. It forms the tools and means by which reality is knowable. This includes a moral dimension, but Tolkien focuses on the aesthetics. Quote, "We should look at green again and be startled anew by blue and yellow and red," he writes, explaining how fantasy serves as recovery, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. The mention of possessiveness here touches on a distinction he makes elsewhere, that appreciation of beauty is something to take part in, something that sublimates the soul to a greater and transcendental experience. This is altogether different from the possessive character of domination, wherein a man seeks to exert power over something he desires. In either case, desire is an operator within the will, but the former surrenders the possessiveness of desire in order for that desire to be the means by which the beauty better enriches the soul. With the latter, he surrenders his appreciation in the misplaced effort to use desire as a means to dominate it. Fantasy, then, according to Tolkien, is the artful act of subcreation that serves, when done properly, to rejuvenate the reader's appreciation of real things. He treats this as a form of escapism, in the sense that modern life, or all life naturally, but modern life especially, forms a prison that requires some time for the soul to think out of its particular box. Is it fair, then, to accuse Tolkien of embracing escapism the way we might more commonly use the term? Tolkien's understanding of the practice, rather than a flight from reality, seems rather quite the opposite. Tolkien's understanding of the practice, rather than a flight from reality, seems quite the opposite, an exercise of more thoroughly engaging with reality after a period of contemplation. By taking time to consider, in his case, the mythical and the fantastic, distinctions are drawn with the everyday and the mundane, which then draws the exterior world into greater focus. "We should meet the centaur and the dragon," he writes, "and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs, and horses, and wolves." The escapism frequently criticized is what Tolkien labels as desertion, and although he doesn't expand much on the topic, its name plainly states what so deserves scorn. This is where idle fantasy lurches toward the realm of idolatry, where the soul is distracted totally from real things in order to flounder in the recesses of the imagination in itself. For the deserter, fantasy does not serve him to better engage with reality, but instead offers him a simulacra of comforts which he uses to deceive himself. To return briefly to Sir Guinness, this is the sort of thing he referred to as the little star shells of madness. Self-professed fanatics of particular titles do not delude themselves into believing that a particular fantasy is real. That's never really been the danger. The danger in their fanaticism is that the duties and obligations owed to real things become sublimated to private, mediocre, and irrelevant desires. And this is facilitated through an overindulgence of fantasy. Fantasy, rather than acting as something of a rejuvenating force for the soul, becomes a prison that the deserter of life flees into. All of this has been well and good. According to Tolkien, fantasy is the genre best suited to the art of narrative literature, as fantasy allows for the maximum entertainment of the imagination. Unlike the more restrained forms of fiction, such as historical romances or realistic dramas, Tolkien considered the fantastic, the fairy world, to keep the most building blocks on the table from which an author can construct his model. The use of the term in common parlance, however, no longer carries with it quite the same connotations that it had in Tolkien's time, a fact he no doubt came increasingly aware of toward the end of his life. True, the sort of fairy story Tolkien wrote had its antecedents in late 19th and early 20th century English writers that Tolkien drew inspiration from. Without getting too deep in the weeds, the modern genre of fantasy, while including the fairy stories of the Isles, traces a genealogy of publication back through the sword and sorcery and pulp fiction of yesteryear. As mentioned earlier, narrative fiction is best considered according to four basic elements: character, plot, setting, and style. All four of these rely on one another in order to bring the story into a form capable of being interpreted, but depending on the author, the genre, and the story in question, it is common for one or two of these elements to be more obvious to the reader than others. Jane Austen's characters and settings are unforgettable, whereas Ulysses is well known for its style. Meanwhile, mystery staples aren't uncommonly formed around specific characters, like Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot, even when the specific works they're known for are plot-heavy puzzle books. Tolkien obviously cared very much about setting. In general, when it comes to genre fiction, style plays a reduced role in determining a particular story's quality than the other three. Style remains, however, the unavoidable means by which the audience first witnesses the other three, so while it's considered with far less weight than a work of high literature, it is nonetheless a relevant component. Some writers of fantasy may disagree on this, pointing out that high fantasy is carried by a sort of heraldic, antiquated, and lofty form of English. No doubt one can cite Tolkien as some inspiration for this, and perhaps rightfully so. Tolkien's fairy stories themselves draw from such use of English. While unorthodox for use in common speech, the highfalutin language seems only appropriate for settings involving dragons, elves, knights, wizards, and kings. In addition, it contributes to the suspension of disbelief necessary for adequate immersion. But that last point is precisely it. The only end for use of such a style is to service the end of escapism. Some beloved stories of the genre may do more with it, certainly. The Lord of the Rings is one, as does Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. But for this reason, among others, it should be disputed as to whether it's fair to judge these books according to the definitions of particular genres rather than according to some more thorough literary mode. Doing so seems to stunt the reader's ability to engage with them, as evidenced, for example, by the shallow critiques of many self-professed fans of Tolkien's works. These can range anywhere from not using the Eagles correctly to believing that the first half of Fellowship is inconsequential roaming while Tolkien spun his wheels in befuddlement. Such thoughtless criticisms can only come about because the reader, informed by pre-existent patterns and tropes of particular genres, expects the story to conform to that genre and thus dispenses with anything that fails to meet that genre standard. When one reads a work of literary fiction, style is at the forefront of the reader's consideration. The characters, plot, and setting are all important, but the style with which these are presented, explored, and depicted are usually of greatest importance to the writer. While writers shouldn't chase after novelty, writers of this sort are nonetheless artists as much as they are communicators, and as such, are using experiments with style in order to seek a more immediate, more deliberate, more impactful means by which the communication of their story can speak to the reader's soul. To reconcile this with Tolkien's definition of art as a form of subcreation, we can again apply the same idea to model building. Style is the usually unseen lens by which the content of a work is brought into focus. In the case of a model diorama, the style will be found in things quickly brushed over by general audiences, the kind of brushes used for specific strokes of paint, the manner in which particular accoutrements are attached and their positioning, the colors used in order to evoke particular moods or recreate certain nostalgic memories. The mark of an artist is that he pays attention to these details in order to better and more immediately depict the image or thought that he seeks to capture with the model in question. Here, the genre of fantasy butts up against what can only be termed consumer media, or media made specifically for consumption. Such terminology doesn't need to differentiate much between what sort of medium in which a given piece is made. Consumable music, movies, young adult novels, comic books, et al. Exist on the same scale as pornography, the ultimate consumer media as far as cultural artifacts go. Differentiating between the two may give the impression that these are opposites sharing a sliding scale. Something like The Lord of the Rings exists on one side of that scale, but as the quality of the piece diminishes, as its writing gets worse, as it draws from the same narrowing pool of familiar ideas and derivative elements, a piece, such as just about any Japanese isekai story that started life in Naro, drifts closer and closer to merely consumable media. While this is possible, it is also possible, and will be argued in the last part of this piece, that consumer media and works of art are two separate things made according to two separate endeavors and engaged with for two separate reasons. In the more than half century since Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings, the fantasy genre has ballooned into a $590 million industry, with publication tutorials, writing guides, author coaches, and plot formulas enough to fill libraries themselves, and this is only limiting to the survey of literature. In printed and digital media, only comic books surpass the genre in sales, and a majority of comic books too can be classified as some form of fantasy. When one factors in television and film, the industrial output cascades well into the billions. It's not hyperbole to consider it the most popular genre of narrative on the planet. While its popularization does nothing to diminish Tolkien's definition of the term, the fact it now has a massive industry driving it prompts a few distinctions to be made. Now, rather than drawing from folklore to aid the invention of a new work, a new writer can instead draw from the pandering illustrations commissioned by boards of directors. As the genre has crystallized around the profit motives of large publishing houses and the PowerPoint presentations of agent-chasing guides, the myths once used to formulate narratives have been replaced with the assumptions best guessed to resonate with the editors of legacy media. The internet has played its role too. Since the 90s, both amateur and professional artwork, stories, renders, and films have crafted for themselves organizational repositories through the use of hashtags. Over-categorization, usually in the effort to publicize work, be it to make it marketable or satisfy search engine optimization algorithms, has resulted in a rigid framework of narrative expectations that few fantasy writers are willing to step outside of. And now, at the cutting edge of technological progress, clever manipulators of AI prompts can find the same niche to exploit. As advances in large language models have come along, AI-generated narratives will quickly become something of a normal occurrence. At a growing rate, writers will use AI to assist in the development of their style, outlining their narrative, tailoring of character, until the genre becomes even more derivative and mediocre than it is now. The introduction of industry to literature changes the mode of writing from prioritizing artistic interest into chasing audiences for clout and money. The writer has to please a publisher, and the publisher has to please an audience. While this system can preserve and even amplify artistic geniuses in some cases, traditional publishing requires a literate and discerning public in order to do so. But a literate public is not what the last half-century of Western media trends has revealed. Far from it, as evidenced by a public that is chased after pornography, comic and picture books, and films with increasingly little to offer their audiences. And so, we reach the end of Part 1. We will reiterate. According to Tolkien, fantasy is the highest form of literature. Narrative art allows for the creation of secondary worlds in which the artist or writer can create models of reality that facilitate escapism. The escape from modern industrialized life, Tolkien asserts, is something to be actively sought after, as it is only through such an escape that a reader can regain the broader context of life necessary to make the events of reality sensible. While all narrative art does such a thing, Tolkien believed that works of fantasy and fairy stories facilitate this recontextualization the best because fantasy introduces alien content to the mind in the form of settings and characters. Yet, being narrative fiction, it does not break fundamental rules of orderliness and sensibility. It serves as something of a shock to the system to encounter dragons and elves in high countries with talking eagles, much more so than a murder mystery that takes place in London. The impulse to subcreate is the beating heart of all artistic endeavors, according to Tolkien. By making a work of art, the artist seeks to better fulfill himself as the image of God, who alone holds pure and true creative power. Still, this subcreative act images the act of creation, and it uses creation in order to do it. One flows into the other, and by engaging in the enterprise, an artist uses the subcreative act to better know reality. In the effort of defining fantasy, we must cross an additional bridge. Tolkien uses escapism as a means to interact with the subcreation of the artist. As a man grows cold in the real world, his desire to escape it sends him either into the artistic mode of creative reproduction or into the contemplative mode of an attuned audience. In either case, his desire to escape the incidental mediocrity results in his attention being turned elsewhere. In this case, to the secondary world of artists. Upon his return from the fantastic sojourn, reality is better illuminated and the forms of real life sharper. A similar, if more intense process occurs in the mind of the writer, who embarks upon a more thorough escape in the act of subcreation. His attention to the details of the imaginary world draw forth from the wellspring of his soul, itself compelled to pour into this new work in a way that images, however crudely, the pouring forth of God's grace into his creation. Against this seemingly mystical take on artistic expression sits the genre-fied industrial output of mass media. In order to properly contrast Tolkien's definition of fantasy, or fairy story, with modern consumer media, we must produce proper examples of both for analysis. Fortunately, The Lord of the Rings itself presents such examples. Part 2 of this piece will cover this exercise, pitting Tolkien's opus up against Jackson's film treatment that bears its name. You have been listening to myself here over at The Pillarist. You can read this as well as the rest of this piece, which has already been written and published and posted to the site, over there at thepillarist.com. If you'd like to support my work, you feel free to share it wherever you can, and as well as I've got links to the Ko-Fi and Patreon in the bottom there. If you've listened this far, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.